Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more alternate history hub. This time, probably something that won't have. Literally, I looked at YouTube Studios, the YouTube, like, that's how you check your analytics and comments and things like that. And on the last alternate history hub video, the one with, the NATO and Russia, I saw within 3 hours of uploads, YouTube Studios was telling me there was 60 comments on that video. I'm not reading that comment section. That's terrifying. It had double the amount of comments than it had likes within 3 hours of upload. I'm not diving into that. I'm not. I refuse. I'm terrified. Um, but yeah, alternate history hub videos have been doing pretty well. So when I've been uploading them, so I figured we'll watch some of his newer ones that I have an interest in. I don't feel like watching his older videos really that much anymore. They don't hit for me anymore. And I just think his newer videos are of such a higher quality that, like, it would just also feel like a bit of a disservice to alternate history to go back to his older ones that are a bit weaker, because I don't think he's that much older than me. I don't know what that had to do with anything. The brain works in mysterious ways. Anyways, this is What If Sweden Won the Great Northern War. Before we dive in, make sure you go and check out the links in the description box below. I would love you to join the Discord and follow me over at Twitch. I don't know if, did I already say that? I can't remember. Let's dive in.
There once was a dream. No, not a dream of Rome. A dream to turn the Baltic Sea into a Baltic lake. To sail from one end to the other and still remain in Sweden. Today there are the same five or so jokes about Sweden that Americans have. One of which is Sweden's famed neutrality. But there was a time that Sweden...
Which is actually might be coming to an end. I don't know how is their NATO progression going? I haven't really heard any updates since Sweden and Finland, after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, came out and said, like, started talking of being open to the idea or whatever.
Sweden was not only not neutral, it was the dominant military power in Europe. It didn't have the largest army, but it did have the best. And that army carved up enough land to create the Swedish Empire. It didn't last as long as the other empires, only about a century or so, but it sure did leave an impression. The story of Sweden's fall is directly tied to Russia's rise. Sweden was directly in the way of Peter the Great and the city he wished to build. The first step the Russians made to become...
They needed that warm, well, no, that isn't a warm water port, but it is a western port. Would the Baltic be a warm water port? I don't think it would be. Would it?
A European power was to take down another. The Great Northern War was a slog that Sweden won. At first, but after 2 decades of fighting and a few key battles, it ended in the defeat of Sweden, the death of their king in a trench, and the loss of all this land. Sweden, for lack of better words, never played with the big boys again, sitting out 2 world wars before inventing IKEA, and then, being Sweden. But what if in an alternate timeline, Sweden won the Great Northern War and kept that empire? Say they remained a major player in European politics. Well, first, I just want to get this out of the way. What even was the Great Northern War? And how could Sweden have won it? At the turn of the 18th century, Sweden was at the top of the world. A whole Gustus Adolphus and some victorious wars will do that. They had it pretty good for far too long, and their neighbors wanted some payback. Enter Peter the Great. Peter wished to bring Russia closer to the rest of Europe, and the only way to do that was to have a western port. And the land that he wanted, called Ingria, was currently controlled by Sweden. So a coalition was formed, and in 1700, Russia, Denmark, Norway, and Polish Lithuania all simultaneously declared war on Sweden. A war on a 16-year-old Charles XII. It was a surprisingly even fight. You see, Charles XII...
That's what the most amazing thing about this war is the fucker was 16 years old. Like, this war was a close one. He was winning until he decided to follow Peter into Russia. Now, of course, we can look at it and perhaps, if I were to do more research into the Great Northern War, really dive into the historical stuff and the military history of it all, there's perhaps an argument to be made that maybe he had no choice but to follow Peter into Russia and try and end it that way. But let's see what Alternate History Hub here says.
12th lived for war. He didn't drink, he didn't even have sex. All Charles wanted to do was conquer. He led his men personally on the battlefield, just like good old Gustus. The Swedish military was often outnumbered, but it was battle-hardened, and it outsmarted and outfought their way out of any situation. To sum up this 21-year conflict, Sweden, or really Charles, won over and over again until he overplayed his hand, led a failed invasion of Russia, and then barely escaped with his life fleeing to the Ottoman Empire.
Yeah.
After this brief refuge, he overstayed his welcome, got a razzle-dazzle with his hosts, was kicked back to Scandinavia, where he would get headshot in a trench in Norway. Like a dead corpse, the buzzards picked Sweden clean apart, and they lost anything that wasn't Sweden or Finland proper. Sweden would lose Finland later. Russia won, Sweden lost, Poland-Lithuania continued to exist until it didn't. So how could Sweden have won this war? Well, for one, it's pretty insane that they did so well to begin with. Charles and his commanders went up against 3 opponents and for a while beat them all back, even going on the offensive at times. With the power of hindsight, we know that Sweden should have stopped when they were ahead. Peter even sent Charles a peace agreement promising to end the conflict as long as Russia could maintain a fort on the Baltic Sea. That was the only thing Peter wanted out of this. Charles, wanting total victory, rejected it, and we all know how that turned out. Perhaps Charles in an alternate timeline does agree to it. Sweden remains the prominent power in the Baltic, while Russia is still able to build up what becomes St. Petersburg. The other scenario, and the more
kind of thinking like a treaty port sort of situation here. I don't know. I don't think that would have lasted long. Well, honestly, with what we know about Peter, we can use the context that we learned about Peter the Great from the History Matters video, and how he didn't pick a successor, and that threw Russia into a bit of a downward spiral for some time after Peter's death, until Catherine the Great came up, which, if we go with the treaty port here situation, Sweden waits until Peter dies. If Peter makes the same decisions that he had made in our timeline, Peter dies without having picked an heir. That becomes an amazing opportunity for Sweden to even perhaps get some sway internally inside of Russia.
drastic one is that Charles absolutely obliterates Peter the Great and the Russian army after the Battle of Narva. In our timeline early in the war, Russia miscalculated a bit, and Sweden pressed against them sooner than they expected. The Battle of Narva was a general rout and a complete disaster for Russia. They were in no position afterwards to fight. And Charles, in response to this, focused on Poland-Lithuania instead. He had a personal grudge he needed to settle, and it really did come back to bite him. Had Charles pressed, his army might have taken out Peter's fighting capabilities, maybe even Peter himself, either
This was the moment I was thinking too. I should have said it at the beginning, but I completely blanked. Yeah, this is the one moment like where we see like I think it was made pretty clear in the Extra History series a while back on the Great Northern War, where yeah, like this would have been a great opportunity to wipe out Russia.
Capturing or killing him on the battlefield. The Great Northern War may have ended up being a quick Russian blunder, discrediting a czar that in our timeline became a national hero that birthed the Russian Empire. So say Sweden actually wins the war, what do they get out of it? Well, for one, they're able to survive, but depending on how badly they beat the Russians, they could move further east and take all of Karelia. I think mainly they would use this victory to solidify the gains they made in the previous century. The aristocrats of Lithuania would be persuaded to be pro-Swedish and not go back to being pro-Polish. Perhaps Poland is even a puppet of the Swedish government and cedes most of their Baltic territory. There are a few regions that Sweden could still expand to, but even if they maintain the territory that they have, this still alters the dynamic of Eastern Europe. The question now, though, is how long will Sweden actually hold it? There's one problem that Sweden will always have to deal with, one that really plagued them at the height of their empire. They barely have a population. Sweden's empire was thanks to two main things. One, they were good at war. Two, their neighbors were currently bad at war. For some reason or another, their neighbors had been in a time of Sweden's
Yeah, especially once we start getting to the latter end here of the 18th century and move into the 19th and then the 20th especially, right? Assuming like everything goes the same elsewhere with the and in place of Russia being the power of the East, it's Sweden, the North and East. The Swedish population, plus even its imperial holdings here in Norway, Finland, the Baltics in general, is not going to be enough to. It's not going to be enough to really truly fight the Napoleonic Wars. Not to the extent that like Russia was able to muster and fight the Napoleonic Wars. And then you get to the 20th century, and that glaring issue is going to be exacerbated immensely. They're not going to be able to fight, right? Like we have on the Western Front more soldiers fighting than there are in the population of Sweden. Now, of course, by the 19th, now, of course, that issue there can potentially change with industrialization inside of Sweden into the 20th century, and Sweden could experience a massive population boom that makes that issue less exacerbated. But, you know, they're still not going to be that populated. They're not going to be like Britain, France, or Germany. You know, their terrain just isn't for a high population. So yeah, that's a
They'd be like the Italians.
Mm.
Ever since the Napoleonic War.
Now, hold on. Now, of course, I have bias because I am of Swedish descent. It's obvious in my last name. Let's not call it like, maybe not, you know, the Italians, okay? We're not that bad, right? I think it would be a good one. Maybe it'd be a bit more like, no, I can't think of, there's no real good examples. Well, maybe the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth might be the best example there. The external influence being pushed upon the Swedish nobility because the Swedes are so outnumbered, right? And the way to adapt would be maybe to, they may be forced to adopt a similar system to that of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, maybe. Although to get the Swedish monarchy to agree to that change could end up being the catalyst that just brings about the end to the empire in general anyways. So, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. I think maybe industrialization could change the game here, but pre-industrialization, I don't think, like, if they gotta make it to the, maybe if they can make it to the 19th century, they might stand a chance at getting a population boom, right? Because they have a good bit of natural resources in Sweden that are beneficial for the industrial age. You know, they've got a lot of iron and some other resources. Maybe there, right? Like they're gonna have to import their food, because they don't have the, right? It's tough to say.
Sweden has been neutral. They just sat out 2 world wars. They were in no state to take on anybody, and the public generally had no strong feelings about getting involved. Can this neutrality in some ways be attributed to Sweden's smaller territory and presence? Oh, absolutely, 100%. Once Sweden lost any remaining territory in the mainland, they didn't even bother anymore with the rest of Europe. So in this alternate timeline, if they're able to maintain this territory, they're very much in play against multiple foes. In such a timeline, if Sweden actually held onto this land, it would be through a series of constant wars with Russia up into the 20th century. This area might be one of the most contested places in Europe. There would be a natural rivalry between Sweden and Russia that just continues into the modern age. Sweden would still be a second-rate power compared to the big boys, but they might be just enough of an annoyance to constantly impede on Russian expansion. If Russia can just never use their number advantage against a far more fortified Swedish border. Granted, this is still incredibly unrealistic. I don't really think Sweden can hold out for a few centuries against Russia. But what if there was, say, a compromise? Charles wouldn't be around forever. Perhaps there could be some territory exchanged in the future where Russia gets that western port in exchange for Sweden getting the rest of Karelia, or having Russia back off. Could the Swedes decide to make such a deal and allow the Russians to potentially build a navy in the Baltic? Or would they know that because of their population, this land couldn't be defended forever anyway? These are the alternate policies the Swedish monarch and government would need to think about, because for the most part, Russia was going to get this land whether Sweden wanted them to or not. It's just whether the Swedes would get something out of it in return. Maybe they would be able to hold the Russians back. If that was the case, the Swedish Navy would be the uncontested power in the Baltic, and depending on how much they unified with Denmark-Norway, they might even be the second largest fleet in Europe. Does this new navy create a potential rival for Britain? Especially one that is only a North Sea away? Maybe. Sweden and Russia, occasionally competing over an increasingly weaker Poland-Lithuania. Perhaps when the split does inevitably come, it's a 4-way split and not between 3. Frankly, as much of a stereotype as it is that Sweden is neutral, this is a relatively new thing. Like, yeah, they became neutral after the Napoleonic Wars, but this also was a time of unprecedented peace throughout Europe, for the most part. Speaking of which, the Second Schleswig War was a part of Germany's wars of unification. Would a stronger Sweden feel more comfortable sending in troops to beat back the Prussians? I'd like to imagine so. They promised that they would do that in our timeline and then just didn't. So maybe if they were in a greater position with a larger population, they'd feel more comfortable going after German unification. So if Sweden fought against this important aspect of German unification, then what would their relation be with the German Empire in World War I? What if Sweden was actually involved? Now, this is under the assumption that the last 2 centuries of alternate politicking had not changed the mindset of the Swedish monarchs, which you never know. But considering the same mentality that existed in our timeline still prevails in this alternate one, fearing the Russians, I wouldn't be too shocked if a more bold Sweden entered the war on the German side. We may see an extended eastern front with a combined German and Swedish assault from Karelia. Maybe this longer line breaks the Russian war effort even quicker than in our history. If Sweden had lost the Baltic coast in an earlier war, maybe this is motivation enough to get involved. Could this lead to naval warfare between the Swedish and British navies? Maybe even an invasion of Norway? Really depends on the size of the Scandinavian modern empire. It could be enough to tip the scales in the Central Powers' favor early on, but this is all depending on alternate troop numbers and what the state of the Swedish Empire even is in by the 20th century. It might be in a rough shape, enough to lead to a complete counter-reaction by the population if the war goes badly. One major reason Sweden was still neutral was because there was a split. Population was more for the Allies, while the conservative government was more for the Central Powers. Had they actually joined the war, Sweden's grain imports would be cut, creating a food crisis that could lead to the government being ousted. Who's to say what the ramifications may be for Sweden if they enter the war and face a crisis that takes them out early on, or even worse, makes them face the same fate as the rest of the Central Powers? It's possible that after centuries, the Swedish Empire isn't seen so fondly by the non-Swedes that actually live there. But this is also under the idea that greater assimilation doesn't happen at all. So that's the thing. What could things look like in this alternate Sweden?
I was kind of leaning towards a little bit in my own mind where it's like, most realistically in my mind, the situation is that they probably still lose the Baltic over time to Russia, but what it becomes is it just becomes slowly a unification of Denmark, Norway, Finland, and Sweden together, just a Scandinavian empire. Um, and that sort of coalition would, I think, be large enough to deter Soviet expansion into Finland because, Russia did not have a good time invading Finland when it was just Finland on its own. If Sweden is able to keep up with its military tradition of excellence that it had in the 16 and 1700s to the modern day, it would definitely be capable of holding back and perhaps even doing better than the Finns were able to do in the Winter War against the Soviets. So that's like the case, right? They might be able to just a unified Scandinavia.
Know what a Finn is.
Oh, hey, Cody.
NordVPN.
Wait, what?
And that was What If Sweden Won the Great Northern War by Alternate History Hub. This was a good episode. Not a favorite. It was good. It didn't really make me very thought-provoking for me, perhaps. But still a good, entertaining one. I hope you guys enjoyed as well. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more. And I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.